This morning, we're going to continue as we walk through the book of Jonah. Don, one of our other pastors, kicked us off this week, or last week, and his big idea was just amazing because he said that we all have this tension, these tipping points, these moments in our lives where we are faced with basically a decision, a choice of, are we going to listen to the voice of God in these situations, in these tipping points, in these moments, or are we going to listen to ourselves or culture or other things in our lives? So we have this tension that we live in constantly every day and in situations that we face of, are we going to listen to God or are we going to listen to ourselves and our own voice and other things? And so Jonah is just a great book. It's a short book, but it's 4 chapters, and it's just a great book. And I love Jonah for two reasons. First, and more importantly, is that Jonah, realistically and practically, is my story. And I think if we're all honest in this room, Jonah really is all of our stories. Because we've all had those moments in our lives where God asked us to do something or spoke to us about something, and we chose to do something else, or to not listen, or something. And so we find ourselves in a similar situation as Jonah. And that's why I love it as a book, and I love Jonah as a character in the Bible narrative. It's just an amazing story, and it's your story, it's my story, it's all our story. So I can find myself in Jonah. I can get down with Jonah because I'm like, yeah, I've been in that situation. I know I've been there. Right? And so that's more importantly. But secondly, the reason I like Jonah, and I'm so glad we're going through it as a church, is that it's the gospel message. As we're leading into Easter, this is the gospel story in a nutshell. In 4 short chapters, you get a beautiful picture of what it means for sin and rebellion to enter into a situation, for people to go in an opposite direction, and for God to come and intervene and send grace and to send mercy and to send love and to rescue. All in 4 short chapters. And it's the beautiful gospel. It's the reason Jesus came. It's our story. But it's the gospel story, it's the gospel narrative in just this short book. And so we dove into that last week in Jonah chapter 1, and we're going to continue in Jonah chapter 2. And what I want to talk about today, as we kind of ended last week with Jonah kind of getting in this thing, this whole situation, is I want to talk about the mess that comes as a result of our problems. And what I mean when I say the mess is that the mess can take one of two ways. It can be, number one, it can be our negative circumstances. And the thing to realize about these circumstances are they're things that you may not decide. They're things that just may come up in your life, that may happen to you, that others may push on you, that just begin to happen in your life. They're just circumstances surrounding your life. And it may not be anything to do with anything that you've decided. But you're there. And it creates a mess and a problem and a situation that you are in and you're going through and you're trying to figure it all out. Anybody have any of those in your life? You know, whether it's a boss or a coworker or a spouse or a child, you're in that, and it's nothing that you've decided, nothing you've done, but you're in this situation, in this mess because of someone else's decisions. But it can also take the shape and the form of negative consequences. And negative consequences are a direct result of something that we've done. It's on us. We have to own it. And that's where we find Jonah, is in the midst of these negative consequences. That's a direct result of a decision that he made to not follow God's voice, when he chose to follow his own plan and his own course of action over God's. And so that's where we find Jonah here in chapter 2. And see, we've all found ourselves in that kind of situation, in either a circumstance or a consequence as a result of our actions. We've all found ourselves in some sort of mess. And that's why we can find hope in the book of Jonah today. And before I dive into chapter 2, just to recap a little bit of chapter 1 about Jonah's mess and the situation that Jonah has found himself in, is that God essentially calls Jonah in chapter 1. He says, Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh. And Nineveh is this city of 120,000 people. It's located in this nation, this up-and-coming nation of Assyria. And he says, I want you to go to these pagan, these unbelievers, these people who may mock my name or curse my name. I want you to take the good news to them. I want you to go and take my love, my hope, my freedom to these people. Now, just to give you a little insight into some Bible history and what may be going on in Jonah's mind, is in those times there was this group of men called the Minor Prophets. That's a great name for a hip-hop group, right? We're the Minor Prophets. You know, that was good, right? Yeah. Might have a career. I don't know. Second calling. I don't know. But so there's this group of these minor prophets, and Jonah is one of them. And there are others like Amos and Nehemiah, and so there's a whole cluster of books in the Bible that are by these minor prophets. And these guys are just basically God's mouthpiece to people. They stand in the gap, and as God speaks to them, they speak His word to the people. And some of them send God's word to Israel. And, because Israel, I don't know if you know this, here's a little clue, but Israel, historically, if you go through the Old Testament, not very good at following God. Not very good at it. There's multiple times where they're complaining and are not doing a very good job of following God. So God has to occasionally send a prophet to say, look, you guys better get it straightened out, or I'm going to use some other country. I'm going to bless some other country to do my work. And so Assyria is one of these up-and-coming countries that is being prophesied to Israel about. Well, and Jonah, no doubt, in his gang of minor prophet rap club, is hearing this stuff, and he's like, Assyria, wait. I'm hearing something from my buddy Amos about Assyria maybe being raised up and God maybe going to use them to punish Israel. I'm not sure. I don't think that really fits into my plan. Why would I go to a nation that God's going to use to punish my people and tell them about God and good news and all this? Why would I do that? That doesn't make sense. I'm not going to do it. And not only does Jonah say he's not going to do it, we'll look in Jonah chapter 1, verse 3. Here's what Jonah decides to do. Not only does he say no to what God asked him, Jonah 1:3, it says, but Jonah got up, went in the opposite direction to get away from the Lord. He went down to the port of Joppa where he found a ship leaving for Tarshish. He bought a ticket and went on board, hoping to escape the Lord by sailing to Tarshish. Now what you got to understand here is not only did he not do what God said, and not only did he do the opposite, is he took the opposite to the extreme. Because in those days, there were these trade routes, and pretty much the geographical world revolved around the Mediterranean Sea. And I should have gotten a map. That's just poor planning. So Tarshish is, they say it's located on the tip of Spain, which is all the way at the tip of the Mediterranean Sea. Nineveh is way over here in Assyria, and Israel's right here. Or Joppa, rather, is right here. So not only did Jonah not do what God said and do the opposite, he said, you know what, I'm going to get as far away from this thing as I possibly can. I'm going to go all the way as far as I possibly can to get away from this whole deal that God's called me to. And of course, the story begins to unfold, and they're on this boat, and you can't outrun God. You can't get away from God. I don't know if that's a news flash, but you can't do it. When God's dealing with you and talking to you, it's best just to kind of give in and lend an ear, because He's going to track you down. He's going to find you, and that's what happens in Jonah's story is he begins to cause the waves to rock the boat, and the sailors are freaking out, and they begin to like, hey, we better pray to our gods. I don't know. We got something deal going on here. So they begin to pray, and nothing's happening. They're like, wait, hey, some Hebrew bought a ticket, and he's down in the hull sleeping. Let's go wake him up and see what he's got to say about this whole situation. And Jonah's like, oh, yeah, well, I got a big God. He's a great God. He's the God of the sea, the God of the air, the God of everything. He's a powerful God. Well, can you pray to that God? Yeah, I could pray to him, but it's not going to help, because you know what? The problem is I'm running from that God. I'm going the opposite direction of that God. So here's the deal. If you want this whole situation to kind of resolve, just throw me in. You guys will be safe. You can throw me in. And we read about that at the end of chapter 1. Verse 15 says, then the sailors picked Jonah up, and they threw him into the raging sea, and the storm stopped at once. That's a pretty amazing thing. The sailors were awestruck by the Lord's great power, and they offered him a sacrifice and vowed to serve him. So that's an amazing, just encapsulated little tidbit of the gospel right there. They saw God do something amazing, and they're like, wow, your God is legit. He's too legit to quit. That's the rap motif, I'm sorry. I'm on it today, sorry. So they see this, and they're like, man, that's a God I can get behind. That's a God I can do something with, but we're just going to throw this guy. Okay, here we go. So verse 17 is really, like in the Hebrew version, this is really the start of chapter 2, even though we talked about it last week. It says, now the Lord had arranged for a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, before we unpack chapter 2, just think about that for a minute. So here's Jonah. He's in the midst of this mess that he has created by these choices that he's made. The consequences of his actions have now begun to affect this whole ship. And his remedy is, just kill me. Just off me right now, because I'm still not going to Nineveh. I'm still not going to do what God told me to do. I would rather die than do what God told me to do. So he has them throw him into the ocean. But God, in His grace and in His mercy and in His love, says that God had arranged for a great fish to come up in the midst of this mess, in the midst of this self-made, disastrous mess, result of Jonah's bad decisions, to swallow him up. And here we find Jonah in the belly of this fish, this stanky, dark fish. And chapter 2 is all about Jonah praying in the midst of this mess and this situation. So as we're in this mess and the messes that we find ourselves in life, I want us to think about, how can we find grace? How can we experience the grace and grab hold of the grace and see the grace of God in the midst of those trials, those messes, those tribulations that we find ourselves in? Whether they're a result of circumstances that's been pushed on us or consequences from decisions that we've made. How do we experience and find God's grace in the midst of those messes? So we're going to pick it up in Jonah chapter 2, and we'll kind of just read it together and pause and just talk a little bit as we walk through it. So if you got your Bibles, you can turn over to Jonah 2, or your tablets or smartphones or whatever the cool kids are using these days. Jonah 2, and it'll be on the screens as well. But Jonah 2 says this in verse 1. It says, "Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from inside the fish. And he said, I cried out to the Lord in my great trouble, and he answered me. I called out to you from the land of the dead, and Lord, you heard me." And the first thing I want to pause on here is that as Jonah's in this dark place, he's beginning possibly to see God's hand in this whole situation. See, he's beginning to understand that he's in a mess, and it's a result of his bad choices, and it's a consequence of his actions. And he would rather die, but now he's not dying. He's in the belly of a fish. He would rather be dead than be in the belly of a fish. I know I probably would. I don't know what happens in the belly of a whale, but I'm not sure I ever want to find out, you know? After watching Nemo, I really not sure, you know? I love that part where she speaks well. Yeah, never mind. Okay. I digress. So we see that Jonah is in this mess, and he calls it a great trouble. But I love what comes next. He says, "And he answered me, I called to you from the land of the dead." I was basically dead. I was left for dead in the water of this fish. I might as well be dead. I'm in the belly of this fish. I'm in this dark place, this great trouble, and Lord, you heard me. So the first principle that I want us to take away in experiencing the grace in the mess is that we have to understand that no matter what mess we're in, no matter where we find ourselves, no matter where our consequences have taken us or circumstances in the life have pushed us, no matter what the mess is, God hears. There's no mess where God cannot hear us. There's no mess you've created, no mess forced upon you, no mess that you're involved in that God cannot hear you. Let's read on. Verse 3. It says, "You threw me into the ocean depths, and I sank down to the heart of the sea. The mighty waters engulfed me. I was buried beneath your wild and stormy waves. Then I said, O Lord, you have driven me from your presence, yet I will look once more toward your holy temple." I'm going to pause right there because one thing that stood out to me as I read that, if you think back to verse 1, or chapter 1, verse 15, it says the sailors, that Jonah basically said, hey, throw me in. The sailors picked him up and they threw him in. But here in this dialogue with God, as he's praying to God, he doesn't say, God, I asked them to throw me in. He says, no. What does he say? You threw me in. So I think what's happening in Jonah's mind is not only is he understanding that God hears him in the midst of this mess that he's made, but in the midst of this mess, Jonah begins to see that God is at work in this whole situation. Even though he has disobeyed and he's trying to get as far away from this situation as possible, that he's beginning to understand, wait, there's something bigger going on here. Because I asked to be in there, but maybe God, that's part of his plan. He said, you had me thrown into the ocean. And so he's in this thing where he's beginning to see that God is at work. Let's continue to read. Verse 5. I sank beneath the waves, and the waters closed over me. Seaweed wrapped itself around my head. I sank down to the very roots of the mountains. I was imprisoned in the earth, whose gates locked shut forever. But you, O Lord, snatched me from the jaws of death. Now it's clear now that Jonah is seeing a much bigger picture. He's understanding, God, you hear me? God, you're possibly at work here. Now, as I'm realizing this, as I was sinking down and these waves are crashing over me and seaweed's wrapping around me, and I'm doomed. I'm sure to die. I'm in the pit. I'm in this mess. I'm sure to die. Now I'm very positive that you're at work here, God. As I'm recalling you sending this fish to swallow me up, as I'm recalling that I'm in the pit of this thing, God, I know that your grace is at work. Your grace is sending this fish. Your grace is working right now. You are at work in this situation. So he's beginning to see it. Verse 7. As my life was slipping away, I remembered the Lord, and my earnest prayer went out to you in your holy temple. Those who worship false gods turn their backs on all of God's mercies. But I will offer sacrifices to you with songs of praise, and I will fulfill my vows, for my salvation comes from the Lord alone. See, now that Jonah's in this mess, he's beginning to understand, God, you hear me. I know you hear me. I know this is a mess that I've created. It's a decision that I've made to turn and go the opposite direction as far away as I can to ensure that I'm not going to do what you asked me to do. You had me thrown in to this water. I would rather die than do what you wanted, but you're at work in that. I understand now that you've sent this fish to save me. I'm in the belly of this fish because of your grace, because of your love, because of your mercy. God, I was sure to die, but you snatched me from the jaws of death. It's beautiful. That's the gospel. That's what Jesus does for us. Every time we make a bad decision or a bad choice where we choose ourselves or our own plan or our own agenda over what God has called us to, as those sins and those poor choices enter into our lives, we find ourselves in these messes. Isn't that what Jesus does? He comes and he snatches us from the jaws of death. I love that in this passage. And so Jonah has come to his senses. He has this come to his senses kind of moment right here in these verses. He's like, you know what, I remember now. I remember this, God. I remember why I began to walk with you. I remember why you're calling me to do this. I remember your grace. I remember your love. I remember your mercy. This is Jonah's come to his senses moment. Anybody ever had one of those come to your senses moments in your life? Yeah, I know I have. I think all of us, if we're really honest, we have. And I'm going to be a little vulnerable today and just share a little bit, just a snippet of my come to the senses moment, because I was a kid who had great parents. They're here today, so that's awesome. Hey. So I'm a kid who was raised in church and a great family, a great mom, a great dad, instilled great values in me. I knew the routines. We went to a good Bible-believing church. I had my ties. I had my, the whole Sears photos of the, I have this picture where I look just like Jim Bakker, man. It's amazing. It is like pretty epic. So I knew the drill. We had the suits, the ties, the whole deal. We would go to church. We would get up early, do that whole thing. We would go to Sunday school. I knew how to act in Sunday school. I knew exactly how to give my dollar in the offering. I knew the whole drill, the whole routine. I had it down. In a word, I was very religious. It was a practice. It was just a routine. But the gospel had not really taken a hold of my heart. And so as I began to age and progress through life, you get older, you begin to start making decisions for yourself. You begin to say no to the Sears photos and the Olin Mills and you get out of that whole phase and you begin to make these whole decisions for yourself. And so as I moved into high school, I began to make decisions for myself. I get a car, I'm able to take myself where I want to go. I'm able to do these things. And so in those moments, in those tipping points in my life where God is speaking and God is saying, remember me, know who I am, know what I've called you to, know where I'm leading you, know where I'm wanting you to go with your life. In those moments where God is speaking and I'm feeling my own urges and my own senses and my own things, and his dad called it, everybody's got to sow their wild oats. I'm not sure what that means, but wild oats were flying, okay? So I was like a wild oat harvester on a crazy day, so it was just good times, but good, but not good. So in high school, I began to make these bad choices, and in the midst of these choices, God begins to use, I don't know if you've heard of these guys, but they're called law enforcement officers. Oh, so you've heard of them, okay. And I love them. God bless them. God used them in my life. I wasn't able to see it then, but I can clearly see it now. But so the law enforcement had begun to take notice of my poor choices, and consequences began to happen. Court dates began to appear. A record began to develop. And so that was me. I began to be marked. And then to make it worse, as I was in the midst of these bad choices, my parents helped me get a car. It was I don't even know what year, but it was an old Civic 5-door wagon. It was epic. I mean, beautiful gold tan interior. And in that phase, you change out the stereo and you put the boom box, and, it was good for listening to my Hammer Go, Hammer MC, Hammer Yo, yeah. So I was just jamming on all that, riding around. Well, one night I just get a wild hair in the midst of a bad choice. I don't know if you know this about me. My mind's not really quite right to begin with, but then you add in other things that alter that state. It's not good. Even poorer decisions begun to be made. So I decided I'm going to turn this Civic, gold, beautiful, amazing car, I'm going to turn it into a race car, a NASCAR of champions. And of course, at that time, and Dad's shaking his head because he's like, oh, God. So at that time, the greatest driver that ever lived was Dale Earnhardt. Woo, Dale. And so I said, well, what better way to transform this beautiful 5-door Civic station wagon into a NASCAR than just go get a couple cans of spray paint down at the Walmart, and let's just spray paint a 3 on the side of the door. So there it was, a number 3 on the side of the door. It's like, oh, now we're getting somewhere. Now we're getting somewhere. But that's not enough, you see, because you got to customize it. Another good driver during those days was Jeff Gordon, and he had this epic paint job of flames on the front of his car. So I got some blue spray paint. It didn't have enough to spring for the red and all that. And I'm not very artistic either, so you can just begin to paint this picture of a 5-door gold Civic station wagon, 4-cylinder, with a black number 3 on the door. Not even pretty, just there. It really looked like a bird flying sideways. It wasn't good. So then I began to spray paint these flames on there, and I'm just like, man, this is awesome. This is so awesome. Just I'm into it, And so I'm driving around town in that. So not only do I have some consequences and poor choices, and law enforcement is already taking notice, well, I just made it really easy for them to spot the idiot on the road, So I'm driving around in this car, getting pulled over left and right, and I'm like, it's discrimination! They're like, dude, nobody in their right mind paints a 3 on their car and those bad of flames. It just doesn't happen when people are in their right mind. And so I began to just have these court dates and all these things, and it all culminated in one summer. Now this was 2 years after I'd graduated, but I decided to go to grad week at the beach. Post-grad is what I call it, because I had decided I was going to be on a 2-year world surveillance plan. Anybody been on one of those? Where you don't go to college. You just kind of get a job, maybe 2 or 3, and you're just kind of just floating through life. And yeah, so that was my plan. That was my goal, was just to be on this world surveillance plan and check it all out. So the beach just fit into that whole MO, it just fit in there. So I went down there and just a cluster of just bad decisions. I think I probably set a record for being taken into the police station the most times in like 5-day period. I'm sure my picture's somewhere down there in Myrtle Beach. It's amazing they still let me go down there, but that's why I wear the glasses, so they don't recognize me. But so I get in there, and I wish I could say it was only one time, but this was about the second time I think I had been pulled in, and I had enough money to get myself out the first time without having to involve the parental units. So I did that. But then the second time, it was a little heftier fine, a little more bad decisions piled on top of already bad decisions. And so I call, and my parents are like, no, don't let him out. Keep him in there because he's going to cost us a fortune if you don't. And I remember just being so angry, so mad that they wouldn't get me out. I'm like, I'm your child. I'm your son, your only son. I'm carrying your name. And I just remember being so angry in that situation, especially the first day. Well, then one day turned into 2, and I think it was 3 days I ended up being in there. So you can see some parallels going on here. But I remember about the 3rd day having my come to senses moment, where I began to just sit there in my own thoughts and my own things and thinking about decisions and choices and life and all these things, and just remembering growing up in church and all these things. And it was at that point that not religion, not rules, not habits that I did as a kid, it's then that the gospel took root in my heart. And I realized that God, this mess that I was in, God, is your grace. It was your grace. All these police officers and all these things, stupid decisions, just bad, stupid stuff. But it's your grace. You're holding me, you're sustaining me, you're pulling me in, you're drawing me. And God, I remember vividly at 19 years old in that holding place in Myrtle Beach, whatever they call it. I remember just sitting there and just in complete surrender, just saying, God, I have really mucked this up. I have made a mess of everything I've known. I've made a mess of my life. I don't know if you can even fix this. But God, here's the deal. If you can do anything at all with what I have, here it is, man. Have at it. Go to work. I'm yours. And from there, I ended up going to Bible college, and from Bible college, becoming a youth pastor, and then I've had some other counseling jobs and all those things. And now here I am at Journey, being completely freaked out in this light, talking to you and sharing a little bit of my life. But that's grace. That's grace in the mess. And that's why I see myself in Jonah, is because he had these consequences of these poor choices. He finds himself in the belly of this whale, and he's crying out to God, and he knows that God hears him. And he's beginning to see that God's at work, and he's beginning to understand the grace of God in this situation. And so some practical just takeaways from this story for me, and I'm just going to pass them on to you, is that when we're in the mess, whether it's circumstantial or whether it's consequence-based, when we find ourselves in those messes, we need to remember a few things that we can take away from Jonah. And the first is that while we're going through the mess, no matter how bad, how big, no matter how big it is, that we need to embrace it. I remember sitting in that holding tank and just being angry and mad and bitter and couldn't believe my parents wouldn't get me out. But as the days progressed, I began to say, okay, maybe God is trying to teach me something. And so as I began to embrace it, grace began to break through. Grace began to soften a hard heart. Grace began to change an altered mind. Grace broke through. And so as we embrace the mess and allow God to reveal His grace, we'll see some amazing things happen. See, the cool thing about Jonah and this whole prayer is that he prayed in a way that I would not have, and probably a majority of us would not have had we been in the belly of a fish. Because my first prayer would not have been, thank you, God, for your grace. My first prayer would have been, God, it is rank in here. It is dark in here. This is not a good situation for me to be in. You got to work. You got to do something. You got to get me out of here. But the cool thing about Jonah is he never, in this whole prayer, he never said, God, if you'll deliver me from this situation, I'll go to Nineveh. If you'll deliver me from this situation, I'll return to you. If you deliver me from this bad situation, this mess that I'm in, I'll serve you wholeheartedly. Never asked to be delivered. His whole prayer is a prayer of gratitude, of thanksgiving for God's grace coming in and snatching him from the jaws of death. It's powerful. It's beautiful. Because when grace begins to be revealed in our mess, something happens in our lives and in our minds. And here's what it is instead of trying to negotiate our way out of the mess or fix a mess on our own, when grace enters in, it changes our heart and it changes our mind so that we're no longer concerned about the mess or the situation. Our only concern in life is God, just get me to you. Just connect me to you. Just let me cling to you. I don't care about this other stuff. I don't care about this mess. I just want to be with you, because if I'm with you, I know that even if this mess causes my demise, even if this is the end of it, if I'm with you, that's okay. Embrace the mess and let God reveal His grace. Secondly, not only embrace it, but remember that no mess. Remember that no mess. Remember that no mess. Remember, no mess. Remember, no mess is too great for God. No mess. No matter where you find yourself, no matter what situations you find yourself in, no matter what consequences you're living in and dealing with, no mess is too great for God. I deserved a big hearty amen. Because we've all been there and we know it. And Jonah's prayer reveals that here's a man who has found himself in what he termed great trouble. I mean, the imagery that's painted of waves crashing and I mean, I can barely stand to boogie board at Myrtle Beach, and the waves coming over me, I start freaking out. So I'm just imagining being in the deep ocean and waves crashing over to the point that seaweed's wrapping around you, and that's a terrible, great, troubling situation. And that's the picture that Jonah's painting and putting out there. But in the midst of that, he says, I remember. And what I remember is that, God, you're bigger than this mess. You're bigger than these circumstances. You're bigger than these consequences, because no mess is too great or too big or too large or too much or too powerful or too anything for you, God. So embrace the mess and let God reveal his grace. Remember that no mess is too great for God. And finally, trust God with the outcome. See, the greatest thing in this story is, after all this prayer, Jonah doesn't pray for deliverance. He comes in gratitude. He remembers that God is with him no matter how big and how messy it is, that God's with him, and he trusts God completely. And he does not know how this is going to turn out. In the belly of this fish, I'm sure all he sees is his demise. And he's come to a point that he realizes that God's grace is at work, and it's with him, and he's clinging to God, not his plan anymore. He's clinging to God and not this situation. And so he doesn't know how this is going to turn out, but he trusts God with the outcome. And see, trusting God in our messes doesn't guarantee that we're going to get the outcome that we think we may get or should get or would get. It doesn't guarantee that outcome. But we can know, if we're clinging to God, that when we trust in God in our messes, we can know that it's going to be all right. Whether it's his outcome or our outcome, we can know that it's all a part of his sovereign plan. And we can trust him in the mess. I want to read a passage out of 2 Corinthians. Get there real quick. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. It'll be on the screens here. Verse 7, it says, we now have this light shining in our hearts. That's what grace does. It's a light shining into darkness. It's a light, a beacon of hope in the mess. We now have this light shining in our hearts, but we ourselves are like fragile clay jars containing this great treasure. This makes it clear that our great power is from God, not from ourselves. When we find ourselves in those messes, the first thing, the natural inclination, is to begin to fight, to begin to try and figure it out, to work it out in our own strength, in our own processes, in our own ways. That's our default. But when God's grace comes into this situation, it changes. We don't hold on to this stuff and we don't try to figure it out. We try to just hold to him. And when we do that, when we reach out for his hand, he begins to pull, instead of us trying to push and rearrange. When we reach out and grab his hand, he pulls us out. It says this makes it clear that our great power is from God, not from ourselves. And here's the beautiful result of clinging to God, of trusting in God instead of ourselves. Verse 8, we are pressed on every side by troubles, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but we're not driven to despair. We're hunted down, but we're never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed. There's no mess too big for God. There's no mess he can't handle. So as we close today, I just want to close with just some questions. And they're really just where are you today in this whole Jonah narrative? Are you running from God? Has God been speaking to you and you're like, no way, not doing that, not going there, I'd rather do my thing? Where are you today? Maybe because of decisions or circumstances in your life, you see it on the horizon. You're headed for a mess. You can see it. It's coming. You see the mess on the horizon. Or maybe you hear this narrative and you're like, man, I just went through that. I've been involved in a mess, and God, I can see now that his grace is bringing me out. Or maybe this morning you're here and this is a last-ditch effort. You're fighting, you're struggling, the seaweed has engulfed you, the waves are crashing, you're right smack dab in the middle of the mess. And you're here because you don't know anywhere else to go and you don't know anybody else to turn to. You feel like there's no escape. Well, I'm here to give you hope that if you can embrace it and let God's grace begin to work, if you can remember there's no mess too big for God, if you can trust in God's outcome, change your life. So where are you today? Because wherever you are, the challenge is to embrace it, to remember there's no mess too big, and to trust in God's outcome. See, in our messes and in our problems and our situations, whether they're circumstances or consequences, in the midst of those messes, we may not always know what God's up to or how it's going to turn out. But when grace enters in and we reach out and we cling to God, we begin to know what He is like. And when we begin to know what He is like, we feel His love, we feel His embrace, we feel His presence. So whatever you're going through, I just want to encourage you. Let grace come in. Remember, there's nothing God can't get you out of. Trust Him. Trust His plan. It may not work out the way you think it should or the way you've drawn it up. You might have to alter your life plan a little bit. But you can trust. Let me pray over you, and then we're going to stand and we're going to worship an amazing God. God, I thank you so much for your grace, for your love, for your presence. And God, in a room like this, I know there are many who've experienced your grace or are in need of your grace right now. And so, God, I just pray that by your Holy Spirit, if there's somebody in here, God, that's just in the midst of this mess, that this is a last-ditch effort, that they don't know where else to go or who else to turn to, God, that these words would breathe life, that your grace would come into that situation, and that you would do a work that only you can do. That you would encourage them that no matter how big of a mess they've made of things, that you hear them, that you're with them, and they can trust you. Thank you so much just for your grace in my life. Every day, life doesn't go according to my plan, but God, I trust in yours. Pray that you would just lead us by your grace. Help us to be receivers of your grace and givers of your grace in this world. We love you. Thank you for your gospel. It's in your mighty name we pray, Jesus.
We hope you've enjoyed engaging in our worship experience. Everything we do at Journey is to help make a difference in people's lives. If God has been moving and working in your life, we would love to hear your story. You can share it with us at mystory@thejourneyonline.com. If you would like to invest in the ministry and mission at Journey Church, you can give online at thejourneyonline.com. Thank you for investing in the lives that are changing at Journey Church.